way they're displayed here, the search engines will understand that. They recognize this.
Well, each of those, well, what you use is your separator. It doesn't really matter. The point is that each of those is a hot link leading to that category.
It's
right.
hierarchical.
Right. So, and here's an example of this, right? If you think about the eBay browse categories page, which is on the home page, they are the king of anchor links, which are those links that are within a breadcrumb environment. So what they've done is not only do these links tell the search engine about all the pages and help guide the search engine to all those pages, it also tells the search engine what the page that it's linking to is about. And this is a key concept in search engine marketing now, which is an anchor link doesn't just tell you, about the page you're on, but it tells you about the page that the anchor link links to. So it's essentially pointing that concept to the other page. So even though that other page, again, in a tiebreaker environment, you've got two identical pages, and one of those pages also has a link pointing to it with that hot linked text with that keyword, that breaks the tie, right? Because what happens is the search engine says, well, somebody said this page was about that, because that's what the link means. Page is about this, right? So in that tiebreaker environment, that extra anchor link power communicates to the search engine what that page is about. So all these various anchor links, paintings, prints, posters, furniture, rugs and carpets, are telling Google, MSN, Yahoo, etc., that those pages are about that thing. So of course, once you get there, those pages also have those same keywords on them. So they're creating a reinforcing effect. And the anchor link sort of multiplies that reinforcement. URL formation. As you surf around the web, you notice URLs look different pretty much wherever you go. Sometimes they have question marks in them. Sometimes they say something JSP, something PHP, ASPX, whatever. The endings don't really matter to the search engines, but there are some dynamic sites are okay. So all those endings with question marks are fine. However, a lot of these content management platforms have the setting for session IDs turned on. What session IDs are, it's a way of the web server being able to track the individual's behavior even more than a log file and even more than a cookie would. So the guys who came up with the idea of session IDs, a lot of times the default on a content management system is to leave session IDs on. The problem with session IDs is that they expire. And what a session ID is in a URL, it's a long string that's uniquely generated at the end of the URL specifically for that session. Now, search engines don't like to spider a URL that has a session ID in it because they know the session ID is going to expire and that the person will get an error page the next time they visit that URL. So they just ignore sites that have session IDs in the URL structure in most cases. In a few cases, I've seen them index some session IDs, but generally they won't. So you want to turn session IDs off. You also don't want an excessive number of query string parameters. What a query string parameter is you get like a question mark, category equals 135, subcategory equals 263, template equals 12, and geography equals US, right? That's a lot of query parameters. You usually don't need them all, right? So sometimes when the developers build them, they put a lot of query parameters in there just to be sort of safe because they're specifying everything. So if you don't need all those query parameters to render the page, then don't use them all because if there's too many, there's a chance that a search engine might think that one of those parameters is in fact a session ID, and then it would penalize you for it. If a page is no longer in existence, use a 404 error page or use the 301 redirect. What a 301 redirect is that you're telling the search engine that the page moved. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, doing it either on an entire domain basis or doing it on a page-by-page basis. And the way in which you execute a 301 is different on every platform. So there could be like an Uber Geek session that we could have to talk about that, but I won't talk about it, partially because I don't know all the different ways of doing it, because particularly in Windows servers, which my team doesn't deal with very often. Go ahead.
So how would you know if you have other than talking to a developer, how would you know session ID URL, for example?
You would see it right away.
I'm using Urchin right now where it says in the analytics session ID or sessions, number of sessions.
No. The concept of sessions and session IDs are very different. Yeah. I mean, the reason they share the word session is because they're essentially defining the same thing. In other words, the session ID is an ID that is good for a session, and in Urchin, they're defining a session by the amount of time a person is on the site. But Urchin doesn't necessarily use the session ID to define its session. It uses the same IP address showing up repeatedly with the same parameters attached to it. So the other thing you can do is in your URL string, you can use descriptive keywords to describe to the search engines or to humans as well sort of how this all fits together. So if we went back to the concept of about.com or the concept of eBay, you know, in creating these subdirectory structures off of the home page, they could name those instead of based on their database ID number. They could actually use the descriptive word there. And again, in a tiebreaker environment, if if it's trying to figure out which page is slightly more relevant for that, it'll sometimes look at the URL structure. So here's an example of links that look dynamic to search engine spiders, right? So you got, in this case, sometimes one query parameter, sometimes 3 query parameters. These are all dynamic pages, and they're all very crawlable by any of the search engines. But, it's possible sometimes to make adjustments to your content management system or your store platform to turn one of these into this, right? Which is much more descriptive, both for a human and for a search engine. So when a human sees this kind of a structure, they understand that that might be the same as this. Could be the identical page. But in one case, you're actually understanding that it's men's boots, work boots. In the other case, we don't know what product 18 in subcategory 164 for event 6 is. That doesn't mean anything to a human, and it doesn't mean anything to a search engine spider either. So this is often called a URL rewrite. It's basically you're taking an existing URL structure and you're rewriting it into something that's a little bit more descriptive, because that, again, can be a tiebreaker. Here's what some session IDs look like. I actually grabbed a couple. These session IDs were both the same page, right? But the session IDs are different. So what that does is that means that the search engine spider won't bother to index the page because it knows that it'll expire. So better to use a format that looks cleaner to the search engine spider and doesn't have the session ID in it. And again, you could go back to a URL formation that's very descriptive. There are a couple of ways to make your URLs more search engine friendly. URL rewrite modules can be used for Linux servers. On Windows servers, use an ISAPI rewrite filter. You can use proxy server systems if you've got a really, really cranky content management system. We don't recommend using those unless it's like an emergency and you can't, like, you're running broad vision and you can't switch, and sometimes the only way to fix something like that is to use a proxy server system. So there's a couple of companies out there that do that. But usually, if you want to make your URLs a little more search engine friendly, it's not that complicated. So that now that your URL structure is more search engine friendly, how do you make the content more search engine friendly? We want to create the new content going forward, at least, in a search engine friendly way. Whether you then choose also to retrofit all your existing content to be more SEO friendly, that's a decision that you'll need to make. You want, not only do you want to get the high rank, though, you also want to make sure that when that listing comes up high, in the search results that your listing gets clicked on. So you also have to think about, well, what is that going to look like if I do actually get a good ranking? What's that link going to look like? And that's because the page title is the most important aspect of thinking about what that link is going to look like, because that's the element that all the search engines show, the page title. And I'm not talking about the page title that you see actually rendered on the page. The page title is actually something you see at the top of the browser in that little blue area. And in the HTML, we saw it as a meta title. That's the primary thing that search engines use to understand the essence of the page and what differentiates one page from another page. Think about that page title from the perspective of each page on your site could potentially be an entry page onto your overall site. And that page title should find a balance between explaining what the page is about, potentially actually getting somebody to click on it, and getting them to take the action to visit your site. You want to distill your site's or your page's purpose down into the essence for the page title. So when you look at a search result, the title is really the key differentiator. So if you think about what these titles look like and how interesting they are to you as somebody who searched, it's going to be very different. So often you can actually, from these, even though I cut and paste them from different searches, you can sort of tell what it was that I searched on because you can see what's still bold. But the idea is that the title should be both clear but also be a little bit compelling. You can also see the descriptions and the URLs there. So, when you pick any page other than your home page, what is it in one sentence, less than 20 words, that you would use to describe that page? So think about your site and think about what you would write as a page title for that site to describe that page to a search engine or to a human. One thing you may want to think about for this exercise is, do I want to lead with my brand, or do I want to lead with what's specifically different about that page? And there's conflicting viewpoints on that, right? You can make every page of your site lead with your brand and then say what's different about that individual page, or you can lead with what's different about that page and then say, at Acme Industries. Usually you'll get slightly higher SEO when you lead with what's unique as opposed to leading with your brand. But a lot of marketing managers say, listen, I want to make sure that they know it's me. So our brand's short enough that I want to lead with the brand and then talk about what's unique about the page afterwards. That's a strategic decision you have to make. So do a title tag exercise now.